Today we're going to be discussing managing digital projects, and our digital archivist, Krystal Thomas, is going to lead the discussion today and kind of teach us about some tools and ways of managing digital projects. So thank you, Krystal.
Good morning, everyone. So just to elaborate a little further, I am the digital archivist here at Stroger Library. I'm also over our Digital Library Center, which is essentially our digital production studio here. So when I talk about digital projects, I'm really thinking about what we primarily do, which is taking primary source material, digitizing it, cataloging it, and putting it into the FSU digital library. However, any of these steps should be able to fit into any sort of digital project you might have in mind, whether that's picking up where we leave off when you take the raw material to build something new on top of it, or if you do want to do sort of a digitization project and build a digital humanities project on top of that. So I'm going to touch on all stages of project management as we do it in the DLC. And I will start with sort of a caveat, as I have discovered in doing project management. What works for us may or may not work for you. So I always give examples. I'll show you documentation, how we keep track of our projects, but that might be overkill for you, or it might not be enough for whatever sort of project you're running. So just keep that in mind when it comes to project management. This is the URL for this particular presentation that Micah just created. So I'll let you guys write that down quick. So to get us started, I just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page with what we're talking about when we talk about project management. This is a definition from Jennifer Venipol, who's sort of a digital projects manager guru. This comes from a reference that I'll give you guys later in this presentation, but she defines project management as the process by which an individual project is organized, overseen, and administered throughout its duration. And I like that she includes administered, because that often gets left out when people are defining project management. And as a project manager, administering the project is probably what you spend the majority of your time doing, so it always strikes me as odd that it gets left out a lot. To break that down a little further, most project management literature will give you 4 stages that go into any project, and that's initiation, planning, execution, and close down. And I throw monitoring and controlling in here because some people will break that out of execution. And I don't want you guys to feel misinformed if you ever find 5 stages instead of 4. This is what these stages break down into in the DLC. We actually lump initiation and planning together for our purposes, and in that stage we do selection, scoping, scheduling, and prepping. Then we go into the execution stage where we do a project briefing and then the actual work of the project. And then we go into what's called the close down, where we have a project debriefing and we close up the project. So now I'm going to talk you through all of these different tasks that are part of these stages. And the first one is selection of your project. So this is probably a little different for us at the DLC because we have projects coming to us from multiple streams. We are part of Special Collections and Archives here, so we have projects coming to us internally through that. We have projects coming to us from other places in the library, such as the Office of Digital Research and Scholarship. We have projects coming to us from libraries all over campus, and we also work with community partners, so local churches, local groups that want us to work with them in digital projects come through us as well. So when it comes to a selection of projects, for us, we're trying to balance certain factors. And even if you aren't juggling multiple projects, you might have multiple ideas, right? Different ideas of what you want to do with your digital humanities project. So some things that we take into account is sort of the cool factor, right? The eye candy. What do people want to see that's just going to blow their minds when we put it online? We're balancing that with some more practical needs. What do people actually want to use online? It might be really prosaic, boring data sets that they want, and they don't really care about the cool thing you want to build. So how do you balance that sort of factor? We're also usually balancing relations with donors, community partners, the expectations of faculty members we're working with, and what we can and can't do in a certain amount of time with a project. And then we're also, because I'm an archivist, thinking about preservation. What are the materials that are most important to preserve in a digital way that maybe will save the physical from some wear and tear as well. So those are all the different sort of factors we're taking into account when we're dealing with the selection of what projects we're going to work on, in what order, and prioritizing them. Once we have selected what project we're going to move forward with, we go into the scoping of the project, which is where we do a lot of work. So here we're looking to get lots of information gathered about what this project's going to look like. We're looking at the goal of the project. What is the ultimate thing we want to have when we get to the end? Under that, we think about deliverables. What are all the different pieces that are going to make that goal a reality towards the end of the project? And to get to that deliverable, what are all the tasks that are required to be done in order to get to them? What are the costs involved? And then what sort of deadline are we working under to get all of that done? We use a bunch of different tools in the DLC to actually get all of that information out of people. So first we want to get the big picture of what our stakeholder is really going for, that really broad idea scope of the project, and that's going to be determined both by your primary stakeholder and by, in my case, my staff. So this is a screenshot, and I give you a way to get to all of the documentation I screenshot for you later on in the presentation. This is a screenshot from our digital projects proposal form. We very purposefully hand this off to whoever is giving us whoever wants to propose a project without much information, because it's really important to get an idea of how your stakeholders thinking about the project before you start to think about how you'd actually do the project. So we give this to whoever wants to bring us a project. They fill it out. It helps them think through all the different pieces of the project. What kind of material, what kind of metadata, what do we want to build at the end, where's all this stuff going to live, who's going to take care of it for the next 50 years. Just gets people thinking about things they might not normally think about when they have that grand idea to start a digital project. So they fill this out and they hand it back into us in the DLC, and then we sit down with them and all of our staff in the DLC, and we try and hash out some agreement. So what does this project look like to both that stakeholder and to the DLC and our workflows and priorities at this time? Who's going to be responsible for what parts of the project? The DLC might do the digitization, the physical materials, but maybe we want the stakeholder to be who's creating the metadata while we do that work. And then finally, what is the expected final result? It never ceases to amaze me how I can read a proposal and come up with a very, very different final result than what the person thought they were telling me they were aiming for. So make sure that everyone actually understands what you're going to build at the end of the project. So out of this form and out of those discussions, we'll do one of two things. Normally, because of who we've worked with in the past in the DLC, we take all the information we get from this, we build it into different documentation, and that goes all into what we call our project briefing, which I'll talk to you about in a few more slides. If we're doing something with more external stakeholders, like we're getting ready to do a project with, what church is it? St. John's Episcopal Church, I believe. We're going to put together a more formal project charter so that everyone sort of signs off very formally with what we're agreeing to do and when we're going to do it. So depending on who you're working with, if it's just your project and it's your team, something very formal like a project charter might not be really necessary. So once you have that big picture scope and you have either your project briefing or your project charter, the next thing you have to worry about is the specifics, the exact material that you're actually going to digitize. And this is the inventory spreadsheet for our current project we're working on. It's a set of publications from our Napoleon collection here. And what this does is list out every issue that is part of larger bound volumes. So this is telling me exactly how many issues we're talking about digitizing and how many pages, which becomes very important when you're trying to actually schedule your project, to know how many pages you're actually talking about. Also, what we do of this is once we have a listing of every set of, every object that we want to digitize, we do copyright review, right? We're looking to make sure we actually legally can put this material online. And we're also looking for duplication. Has someone else somewhere in the world already made a publicly available copy of this object? It's not really something we like to do, waste time and resources to digitize something that's already freely available elsewhere. And then the other thing we'll do with this inventory spreadsheet is we'll look at any preservation concerns and where those sorts of concerns might exist in the workflow of the project, whether they need to be taken care of before, whether it's something a DLC staff can take care of during, maybe during digitization, they'll refolder or rehouse materials as they work, or is it something that needs to be taken care of after, where you're going to send all of the material you've been working with to someone else to take care of any preservation concerns that might exist. The inventory spreadsheet also, thanks to our metadata librarian, does double duty. Eventually what we do with this is this turns into our metadata creation spreadsheet, and all of this gets exported out to be metadata records that we use in the digital library later on. So it's always nice when you can also repurpose work that you do during your planning stages. This is a screenshot of Productive, which is the project management software we have been testing in the DLC for a while now. I will talk more in depth about project management tools towards the end of the presentation, but this just happens to be the one that we use, so I use it as my example here. So at this point in scoping the project, and at this stage you've got a good idea of your broad goal for the project, you now have your specifics, you can start to outline all the tasks that will actually go into the work of the project. So this is a project that you can sort of see here. So I've got this highlighted, this is one task, and then it has multiple subtasks that have to be done. This one does not have deadlines, it never did. This was a very sort of a rolling project. It had to be finished no matter when we actually finished it. It was for university archives. So we never had set deadlines, but the whole project was always outlined before we sat down as a team and had our project briefing. So once you have that outline, you have your scope, you have a really good idea of how much material you're actually talking about dealing with in your project, you can start to create a schedule for your project. Now at this point, it's probably still going to be kind of nebulous, or at least it usually is for the DLC. It really isn't until we're through the entire prepping stage that we have a really good handle on what our exact deadlines are going to be. But what I do here, and that is key to us planning and scheduling in the DLC, is I figure out how many hours we're talking about. Are we talking about a project that's going to take 200 hours, or are we talking about a project that's going to take like 1,000 hours? And how does that fit in with the rest of our planned projects that have a different set of hours? Also in the DLC, what I can start to take into account at this point is what equipment we're going to use. What scanner is required for this particular project? Is it already lined up for 3 other projects ahead of it? Is someone in the DLC going on a 3-week vacation? That kind of stuff you have to start to think about when you're thinking about how many hours you're talking about. You start to think about the resources you also have for this particular project. So this is a screenshot of our digitization time approximants that we maintain in the DLC. And my studio manager updates this on a yearly basis, and this allows me to estimate just how long it will take them to do certain materials on certain kinds of equipment. So if I know I have 300 books, and that's 10,000 pages, I can look and see how long each book would take on the 3 different apparatus we do books on, and figure out which one fits this project best, and how many hours we're actually talking about doing the project on that piece of equipment. My metadata librarian has a similar document for how long his work takes. Metadata is a little trickier because Matthew, the librarian, is often sort of supervising other people doing that work. We have students that are really, really good at metadata creation and other students that aren't. So sometimes that's actually harder to estimate how many hours that piece of the work might take versus digitization, which is pretty finite. Our staff's really good, and these numbers are usually spot on when it comes to actually planning for the project. So at this point, we have an outline of our project. We have an idea of how many hours we're actually talking about. We have good grasp. So the thing you want to do in the prepping stage is get all of that information you've just collected in all of your other stages into one place. Co-locate that in whatever documentation forms that you have, but make sure it's in a place where everyone that is part of your project can get to it. This is that whole hit by the car principle. If it's sitting on your laptop and your laptop dies on you, or you leave it at home one day and no one in your team has access to that information either, you're in trouble. So if you have, even if it's just you and another person, make sure there's some central location that you can both get to, so you can always get to the project documentation no matter what might happen to you or anyone else on your team. or what might happen to your equipment, because computers die. So a painful death sometimes. At this point, you're also going to finalize your project task list in whatever project management tool you're working on. You should have a really good handle on what steps are needed, what workflows you might be using at this point. You're also going to finalize your timeline, because now you know the exact tasks and the exact amount of material you have, and you know your availability for the project at this point. So you're going to actually go and put those deadlines in your outline of your project tool, whatever it is you're using. And then lastly, for us, because we are such a almost strict digitization shop a lot of the time, we do all the prepping of the physical materials. That might mean things get rehoused before we do work. It might mean we're marking materials that we are not including in the digitization project, which happens a lot with archival collections. We usually aren't digitizing the entire thing, but select objects. So we have to make sure that's very clearly marked for those that are going to be doing the digitization work. So this is a screenshot again of product heap. This is with a project that has deadlines, and this all crossed off because it's a project we finished earlier this year. But you can see that each step had deadlines that went with it. We met all of these deadlines, if I recall correctly. Our deadlines tend to be a little more fluid in the DLC. We're not usually working under any sort of, or we haven't at this point been working under sort of a grant deadline at all, so if we miss our deadlines by a couple weeks, it's not the end of the world for us. But it's always good to have those markers and to keep on top of your team and be like, so we're coming up on this deadline. Where are we at? How are we gonna make it? It's all part of being a fun project manager. So at this point, we have reached the project briefing. The project briefing document pretty much will have all of the information you've gathered in all of your different planning stages. And it has 5 main areas. The first one is sort of your project overview. So that big picture idea, right? Why on earth are we doing this work? I found that really helpful in the DLC so that they have some idea of where their work fits in a bigger picture of special collections and archives. We list out the scope so that they know exactly what is included and what is not included in the project. We list out the major deliverables, which for us is often very clearly stating to all the people on the team sort of what they're called modules that we're going to use in our digital library, and that often will require them to sometimes scan in different ways. So it's important that they understand that that's a deliverable for them. We list out any possible issues or concerns with the project. This is basically where you put all the weird stuff. We have a project that just went into the DLC that has all sorts of odd things. We're doing sampling of certain folders where there's lots of canceled checks, but we only really wanted to do a percentage of them. There's locks of hair in there that we're not touching, and all this sort of weird stuff that you might find when you're working with physical collections that you just want to make sure that your team is prepared to deal with. And if you've made decisions about how they're going to be dealt with, you put it in the project briefing. You put the timeline in the project briefing, you make sure everyone is aware of it and that everyone agrees with it and that you haven't forgotten anything massive. It's always nice to have someone checking your timeline. And then lastly, make sure that it's clear any communication paths for the project. You know, how are you and your team going to communicate? And also if there are any external stakeholders that are maybe just tangentially interested in your project, that you're figuring out how you're going to tell them where you're at and what you're doing. So this is a screenshot from the project we're working on right now, the Monitor. And you'll see that it's laid out exactly like I just told you. And here the possible issues were that there's weird things with dates. It's from the French Revolution. They made their own calendar for a while, so I wanted to make sure that they were paying attention to where issues stopped and started. That kind of stuff is what you want to make sure your team is well aware of. So finally, after all of that planning, because planning can be really boring, I'm not gonna lie. And you don't have a ton to show for it when you get to this part, but it's really important. If you read most of the project management literature, they'll say you want to spend maybe about 25% of the entire amount of time you spend on a project in the planning stages. We probably spend more like 35%. We found it really, really beneficial to put a lot of time into all those planning stages before we get to the project so that things go a lot more smoothly once we get up and running. So once you've gotten here, if you did all of your work in the planning stages and you planned correctly, everybody already knows what they're supposed to do at this point. You sort of just press a button, hit go, and it should work like clockwork, right? Communication should be occurring very regularly, either through meetings you have with your team, whatever communication channels you might be using, just to make sure that you and everyone on the team is really very cognizant of where the project is at. And then the other fun thing you're going to do in this stage is deal with all the problems that come up. Because no matter how much time you spend in planning, there will be problems that come up. Things that got missed, a workflow that you thought was going to work brilliantly, all of a sudden doesn't work at all for some reason. So you're going to be dealing with that and documenting any issues as they come up in a project to make sure that everyone's aware that there has been this problem and you came up with the solution. Once you finish, you're super excited. Don't celebrate just yet. Make sure that you have a project debriefing meeting. And the reason for this is, well, there's lots of reasons, and we have a really good example of why we have it now in the DLC. But mainly you want to make sure that everyone's aware of what went well, what didn't go well, and what on earth we're going to do to fix what didn't go well. So you talk about your successes, the challenges, and then you're going to talk about how do you fix any of the problems that occurred, and also how do you take anything you learned from this project and put it towards the next one. Now the next one might be what we call the rinse and repeat, the exact same project just with new materials. Or it could be you've done the digitization part of a project and now you have to actually go and do something with all of that raw material you just created in that stage of the project. So never just celebrate the end of a project. Make sure you take a moment and really think about what you learned from that project and how you can move that forward with you as well. So this is a screenshot from one of our project debriefs. This is a screenshot from the project that sort of imploded in the DLC. There were lots of things that went wrong. There were lots of communication issues. And one thing that we learned in terms of our team with this is they really did not want to disappoint me. But I had made a really bad decision, and they were trying so hard to make that bad decision work that they were starting to fight, and there was all this problem with the material. So what we learned is that they needed to be comfortable to tell me when I was wrong. And that I also needed to be a little more forthcoming when I thought I saw tension growing between them, asking about what was happening. So I say that only to remind you that in digital projects, and pretty much any project management you'll ever do, if your team has a problem, the whole project is going to have a problem. So the project debrief can be really uncomfortable sometimes because you're trying not to blame anyone. You're trying to make sure everyone feels comfortable enough to tell you, their boss, when something's wrong. But you also want to make sure they're comfortable enough to be like, well, there was this communication with this person because this happened, and then this person wasn't listening to me. It can sometimes become a bit of a therapy session. But that's a good thing. You learn a lot about your team, how they work together, and what they're willing to tell you about how they're working together. So it's another one of those, how do I want to say, fun things about being a manager in general that comes along with project management that you probably don't think about when you get started on a digital project in particular. And then lastly, we get out to the closing out of the project. And this step will depend on what kind of project and what sort of reporting you're required to do with your project. For us, this is purely to our benefit, the steps that we take in the closing out of the project. So what I do is I make sure any documentation, the project briefing, the inventory spreadsheets, the project debriefing documents, the original proposal, any other documentation that involves this project at all gets put into a single location. For us, it's SharePoint. That's what we use here in the library. And I also, and it's one of the reasons we use the project management tool that we do, I can create an archive of the list of tasks, subtasks, and any notes that were put in there as well, and put that with all the project documentation as well. And we do that for two reasons. One, so that we can return back to it, because if 3 years down the road we're like, oh, we have another collection with hair in it, what did we do with the last one? We could look back at this project and reference the decisions we made for that. But it's also when you get questions. Why did you make that decision? Why did you do that? We've had that a couple of times with a project we did with the Claude Pepper Diaries. We decided not to digitize blank pages. And we put a little note in there that said, December 1st through 15th are omitted because the pages were blank. We had someone question us on that, like, well, why did you do that? Those pages could be important. So we had to reference why we made that decision, because it was standard best practice in our field to do that with blank pages to save time, and also to be useful to historians that don't have to flip through 15 blank pages to get to writing. But it was good to have our documentation to say this is why we made this decision and why we signed off on it. The other steps you're going to do once you've gathered all your documentation and put it wherever you're going to keep it forever is now you can tell people you're finished, right? You can have your bottle of champagne and shout it from the rooftops and make sure that you're telling the right people, the areas that will be most interested in this research. But for us, it's also making sure that library cataloging is aware that this set of 200 books is now available digitally, so that they can update the catalog record, so that when someone comes looking for it, they can find the digital copy if they can't actually physically come to the library for whatever reason. Or making sure that finding aids for our archival material are updated, so that someone in England who wants to see a collection realizes it's already online and he can see it from where he lives. So it's all of that communication piece of closing out the project and making sure that someone other than you and your team are aware that you have finished. So we're going to switch gears just slightly. We've gone through all the stages and all the different tasks of the stages. I did want to touch on project management tools, what you're actually using to track the work of the project. I always do this with a caveat because I have noticed in the library world that we really like fancy toys, and we like fancy tools, and we like lots of bells and whistles, which is great, and if that works well for your team, go for it. However, I have also worked on projects where the spreadsheet was my friend. Simple listing of every task needed, person's name next to it, the date it's supposed to be completed, and any notes as they work. It can be as simple and as easy as that, as long as everyone on the team can get to that spreadsheet. And again, make sure you have it in that single location where everyone can get to it. If you want something a little more formal, there are plenty of project management tools available for free. You put that in Google, you'll get thousands of results. These are three that I know work really well. Trello is used extensively by the Office of Digital Research and Scholarship. Productive, which I think I kind of did in the levels of bells and whistles in a sense. Productive is a little more, I don't want to call it fancy, has a little more bells and whistles than Trello does. And then Asana is like a little crazy. But some people really love all the different abilities to assign tasks, really keep track. There's reporting out of Asana that you can do. I will say that you might have to try some of these and decide which one works best for you and your team. And don't be afraid to say it's not working. We tried Trello and the DLC, and for whatever reason, it just didn't work with how our workflows were working and how we communicate. Productive seems to fit us a little better for whatever reason. So you might start with something and decide, nope, not working. Stop and think about why it's not working, and then go see what a product might look like that would work for you. With communication tools, we're very big on Slack here in the library. The DLC has its own Slack channel. They have taken to it really well, so I've been happy with that. It's a really easy way for us to communicate quickly and not fill our inboxes with email with lots of questions that would have been easier just to put into Slack. Email is always good though too. And I always remind people that Skype has a chat function, so that if you're working with a team that's far afield, you could also use that if a Slack channel isn't really something you're interested in. One thing, I don't want to call it a caveat, but project management tools are only as good as the buy-in you get from your team, right? They're only as good as the fact that people on your team are actually going to use them. Buy-in can be really tricky. People get very set in their ways. People don't want another login to remember, another site to check, all that sort of thing. So a lot of these tools have ways to tap into if they're really set on their email. They'll get reminders, or you can set up emails to send through them so that every time you mention their name, they get an email saying, hey, this thing has been said about you. It can be a way to sort of force buy-in by an email for certain things. Also, I don't want to say you get mean, get pretty strong about sometimes being like, that answer is in Productive. You can see that answer there, rather than giving them the answer over and over again. Reminding them where they can find that answer over and over again might just be your best option to make sure you start to get your team's buy-in there. So these are some resources that I wanted to also give you guys. These all should link to the correct location once you get to the presentation. The Library of Congress used to give a digital project planning and management basics course. They don't really give it so much anymore, but all of the material, the handouts, the slides, everything are all online. It's getting slightly dated, but it's still got really good basic foundations for any sort of project planning. Jennifer Menipol, who I cited earlier in the presentation, her Introduction to Project Management for Libraries slideshow with all of her notes is available online. Peter Savoni was working for OCLC at the time that he wrote a series on digital library project management. If you search for that title or his name, it'll come up in any of the library databases, really. It's an entire series about digital library project management. He also has a really awesome article about what not to do for digital library project management, which is really quite delightful and very spot on. The next one is the Crowdsourced Library Project Management Toolkit. DLF is the Digital Library Federation. They have a project management sort of working group maintained in their membership, and the Crowdsourced Toolkit has people that are part of DLF just writing in their recommendations for tracking projects. They do reviews on tools, so it might be a good place to go and see what people thought about different tools that you might be thinking about using for tracking projects. And then lastly, there's the UCLA Special Collections Digital Project Toolkit. It is very specific to special collections, but I think you could probably finagle to fit any sort of digital project. What they do is take you step by step, provide all the documentation used in every step of their digital project, and you can pretty much steal any of that you want to use or repurpose any that they've put out there. So it's been a really good resource for us in the DLC as we've tried to update and change our workflows a little bit. And then this is a direct link to a folder on Google Drive that has the full examples of all the documentation that I screenshot for the different slides, so that you can go through and poke through the entire proposal form. You can poke through an entire inventory spreadsheet if you feel the need to. It has project briefings, debriefings, and I think there's also, because I'm repurposing this from a different presentation, some other documentation that may or may not be useful to you. I think there's a draft of a digital collections development policy in there, which may or may not be helpful depending on what project you're thinking of doing. This is a listing of all the different digital humanities events that are happening in the library this fall. There's the Percolator, the Slack channel that's specific to digital scholarship, and then of course our symposium in November on invisible work and the digital humanities, which you should register for if you want to go, because it's limited, and I highly recommend that you do. And then that is it for me. Does anyone have any questions?
So I have tried to get some of my colleagues to use Slack. And one of the first objections is that it is not compatible with Florida's Sunshine Laws. So how do you all negotiate that?
We just started working on that at University Archives, actually, because business is being conducted in Slack, so we have a responsibility to maintain it. We haven't gotten very far in how we're going to do so yet. I was only just actually look at sort of what their archive functions are, how you would take it out. In terms of using it in departments, at that point you would just talk to our university archivist. But I'm betting if it's doing what it should be doing, there should be a really easy button that's just like collect archive or something like that. Most systems like that do.
No,
After 10,000.
so after 10,000 messages start to disappear. So what I've heard of other people doing is doing periodic dumps out of so every 3 months they'll dump everything out of Slack, and that becomes, export the archive, and then they save that and they snapshot it. And then, so that's the workaround if you're not going to pay for the paper.
And how do you, in what format does it export it as?
No idea. I've never looked at it.
Yeah, like I said, it was just literally yesterday I was tasked by our university archivist to look at how we would be doing that. But it's an understandable concern. If you're going to do actual university business, it does need to be kept. Any other questions?
Actually, well, I wanted to kind of see if we maybe like talk a little bit with you sort of about porting over some of the things that you've talked about today into the more humanities context. In part, one of the things that fascinates me is this idea of documenting projects, especially from an early stage, which I think in traditional humanities work, it's often like, hide all that planning work, like don't make it explicit, like the only thing that you should have is the finished article or book or whatever. And I mean, I was wondering if anyone had any thoughts on that, either in the audience or you, kind of like getting used to the idea of documenting your work.
Well, I can talk to that from my perspective, because I don't come from a traditional academic background. I came through library school and we're trained that everything should be out there for the world to see, including all of your mistakes, which can be a little daunting when a project blows up in your face that you then need to make public every way that it went wrong. So we don't have the same tradition kind of as guarding an idea until you have that perfect finished product to give people. We often, in fact, our publishing in the library world is often talking about how we did screw up. So documenting something from the very beginning is pretty important to us from a professional standpoint as well, so that someday we can talk about in an article all the ways that went wrong and then how we fix it at the end. So I think that comes from my academic background, is that we keep track of everything from the very start so that we can refer back to it. We also have sort of that burden of the user at the other end asking us a question about why we made certain decisions, which is another reason documentation is so important. From our perspective with our digital projects, when we get the historian asking us, why didn't you digitize the entire blank journal of 1982? Like, that could be important, the fact that he didn't write a single thing in it. And then we made a decision about that, and we could say, this is the decision we made, and refer back to that. And eventually I would very much like to also make it even more public. All that stuff sort of sits behind the internal library wall. I think it would be very cool to actually share all of our project documentation more publicly, so that people can see the decisions we made from the very start of a project to the end.
So I haven't been involved in a digital project yet, but my experience with working with it as a team for another project last year, so it was a project involving three people, and we had to go through all the stages, planning, all of that, and planning is really important. Communication issues come up. If you don't have a record of everything that you've been discussing back and forth, it can be, can be very ugly. It's like, I know we've talked about this. I know the answer is somewhere in the email, and I think our email, for example, the current email we have at FSU, it doesn't work really well. It's very easy to lose track of where things are and finding exactly what you want to find. And sometimes it takes so long. So I think now, thinking back after we didn't have a debriefing, the project is still ongoing, although it's a little bit, it has moved along. But there's so many things I realized should have been done better. Documentation is one of them. Having a better system at, where to put everything, all of the information for all of the team members, instead of just putting it in the email, is another thing. I think the importance of face-to-face meetings with the whole team, if that can be arranged, because I think we lost a lot of time. Like the team, it was very hard for us to coordinate, so that that leads to more time. You have to meet with one person and then meet with the other person and then the other two people. I don't know. I think we lost a lot of time with things. Simple things that should have been better organized. So this helps a lot. Even more generally, like in anything that has to do with the team project. From digital
Yeah, I'm flipping through Jen Vitapul's slides right now. She has this great one that says, don't get hung up on tools, focus on planning and communication.
Yeah.
So if you could plan well, and like Krystal said, 65%, 35%?
35% is where we're at with our timing right now.
Yeah, of some of the bigger projects that Sarah and I are involved in, we've been in planning for 6 months, or with Krystal too, 6 months with Paul Neal. But we're not even starting the project yet. We're still planning, because we need to make sure that we plan really effectively. And then next thing that Sarah and I just talked about today is we need to figure out the most effective way to communicate with, it's a pretty small team, but we do need to have a way to communicate that everybody knows where to look for communication or project details or documentation or all that.
I found issues with both Google Docs and Dropbox. different issues, but I think Dropbox has a problem sometimes when, you know, you have a shared folder and I couldn't access the folder that my team member had created. I had to go the long way, and it was so annoying. And then Google Docs, that still blows my mind. Like, I'm not sure like how I create so many versions of the same thing over and over. That kills me. It's like I still don't know what, you know. I don't like either. So that's another thing. Like, you want to share a lot of documents, and it can be hard. And you cannot send everything by attachment either.
Instead of going into Docs itself, you can go to Google Drive, which is just a big file repository, and then you can just put files there.
Yeah.
Same.
Or like we covered last week, GitHub could be a good version of it. A good tool for versioning, centralized.
Right.
But then there's a different learning curve to GitHub.
But I think I do agree that planning is very important, because if you don't do it right, it comes back actually again, and you lose time. So it is better to plan as much. I do agree.
One of the things we've learned the hard way to some extent in the DLC is we tried very hard to get to what I call that rinse and repeat, right? Where you're just plugging in new material that's going to go the same exact workflow every time. And where we've learned we can't do that is because our material changes every time. You know, we'll have a set of books one time, we'll have a set of archival material the next time, we'll have a set of books and archival material that need to be treated very differently within a project. And so for a while we ran into an issue. We were trying to sort of rush through that planning stage. We're like, oh, it's a set of books. We've done this like 5 times already. We're good, we're fine. And then we open up and find out that the books have foldouts that are like giant pages that have been like tucked inside the binding. And that changed the entire project for us. In fact, that project got kind of sidelined until we could figure out how on earth we were going to deal with giant foldouts in a book. So we've sort of learned to step back in planning and not assume that even though it's 200 books coming in, we actually know how to do 200 books anymore. You know, eventually we might get to a point where we are like, yeah, it's 200 books, and we look through it and it's a straight up set of 200 books, and we can just fly through planning at this point. But at this point, we're erring sort of on the side of caution so that we don't take on a project where we really don't know what we're getting into before we start it. So that's another reason we spend so much time in planning right now too, is because we were trying really hard not to anymore, right? Because we wanted projects to start moving through a little faster, and we just ended up with more problems really at the end of the day than was worth it.
Can I return there's a question about the humanities inflected version, and then there's sort of a side door, because one part is kind of a professional thing about the world you were saying you come from, and on the flip side, what you were referring to, that academic world where most academics are trained, professors especially, but grad students too, trained that it's kind of like alchemy, like, yeah, you go do your research, and what happens is you figure out how to do it, and you don't actually kind of get a set of steps beyond that, and then a lot of the process becomes kind of the refuse that you throw away, or that you archive away in boxes and never look at for 20 years. But the question is actually about, you had on there, Born Digital is one of the options for the kind of material that come in. So, I mean, has the library done a lot of art projects with Born Digital artifacts? And I ask because, in a way, what scholars produce, or that kind of daily record, is essentially a special case of the Born Digital artifact. And, you know, it's true that we're not in the habit of doing it, but I wonder, and that's cultural in a certain way. You know, the culture, you got to protect it and steal it. But it's also this digital humanities question, which is very pressing, about how to maintain or have these projects with Born digital artifacts. And that. So I mean, are there things that are different about that in your experience so far? And I don't know, does that get us to humanities?
It is to some extent. So we know it's coming, particularly in university archives, because someday, you know, you as a faculty member is going to retire, and when we come to get your papers, you're going to hand us 3 hard drives. You know, it's not like you're going to have, well, you might also have like 10 filing cabinets, but you're also going to have 3 hard drives that probably go along, maybe more. So how do we handle something like that? And it is pretty much handled exactly the same as any sort of digitization project that might come through. It just has a different workflow, what we call the digital processing workflow. And we're working more on this too, because it's something we haven't done extensively yet, but we know it's coming more and more. So we're working on how we can leverage our digital library infrastructure to feed that sort of material directly into the digital library and do all the sort of processing work that we normally do in boxes in the digital library environment, and how that might work. Born Digital also has a whole other set, particularly on the archival side, that comes along trying to make sure, we have to be able to guarantee that this is the authentic document. We didn't go in and change 3 paragraphs that you wrote 20 years ago because you asked us to. So we need to be able to prove fixity of the document in a way that we don't have to worry so much about paper. There's also, viruses, and if you wrote in WordPerfect 15 years ago, how can we open that tomorrow? So Born Digital comes with a whole different slew of concerns that traditional digitization doesn't. But it's something we're definitely working on, and I think digital humanities comes into it a little because of ways that we're figuring out how to show that kind of work. So one project that comes to mind, that's in the archival world, but it sort of is applicable here, is Salman Rushdie gave his papers to Emory University, and he gave them his computers too. Like, he handed over his computers. And so they were tasked with trying to maintain that environment the older and older it gets. They went with what we call the computer museum option, where they're maintaining the hardware technically and using emulators so that a user can come in and use that computer as if he had walked away from it 5 minutes ago. So there's that idea of emulation that comes into it. And I think the digital humanities is moving in that direction a little when it comes to Born Digital, is how to emulate the environment that you're working in to get the same kind of result. Digital art comes to mind a lot with that kind of thing too. If they built something 15 years ago in some system that no longer exists, how do we render that for someone to look at in our museum today? So there's lots of different weirder questions, I think, with Born Digital material, and I think the digital humanities are a really great place to start to tackle them more, because you guys know your material and you know what so with digital art, one of the questions is always, what is the purpose? What is the viewer supposed to feel and get out of that piece of art? Maybe it is important that it's still in the same computing environment that it was designed in. Maybe it's not. Maybe there's some other way we can render that doesn't keep the exact experience you would have had in an art museum 15 years ago, but still has the same feeling as what the creator meant for the viewer to get. So I think there's cool questions with Born Digital and how the humanities can start to think about those kinds of questions in their work today and what they want their work to be seen as 20 years down the road. If that answers or helps.
Yeah, no, I was
Censor.
just trying to see where your point went exactly. It seems really pressing that, and I think in part, how, the other way is asking is how would you get researchers to document their projects as they go, and when there's so many institutional incentives not to, because of a fear which may not be justified about having your work stolen, but also an inertia in that direction and a complete lack of anyone telling you to do it differently. I mean, I doubt any professors you could poll on campus would tell their students that they really should spend time documenting their work as opposed to just getting to the product. So,
well, it also brings up the fact that, there are university policies about ownership of data, and the fact that, especially in humanities, faculty have no conception of any of the things that they work with as data, and so it's hard to get them thinking. Faculty generally just, I think, aren't aware of the fact that the university does own their data.
well, and probably really effective.
Yeah, but then on top of that, in the humanities,
Well, it's a joint ownership.
yeah.
Well, it actually depends on how it was created. I've spent in January of this year at the ODO, we spent about 2 days with the lawyers because we have issues talking about when you create an online course, who owns the content. So
I think, I'm thinking specifically of research data rather than
true, but
pedagogical data.
I think the way that the collective bargaining agreement states ownership is, it comes down to when it's created, where, and under certain conditions. So it's really variable. I mean, down to, was this created on your personal computer or was it created on a school computer? Those can make all the difference right there.
That's just a piece of that.
Yeah.
Not something faculty are trained to think about.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not something, and especially humanities faculty who don't have, don't think about their research as data. So, yeah. It'll be interesting going forward. Will we be getting hard drives from certain departments, you know? Or just like print manuscripts printed out from, yeah.
It's possible. There are certain archives that's literally what they're doing with certain things. Like when they get an email archive in, they're not sure about how to preserve those long term, so they just print everything out and keep it on paper because they know how to keep paper in a safe environment for hundreds of years.
But it's fascinating too, because you know, the digital management, there are people at the beginning talking a lot of it about surpassing the medium, like somehow getting it so that it's freeform, but as time passes, the medium becomes even more important because now you're dealing, maybe your computer is an artifact that you have to deal with. So in a way, you can't escape the materiality of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually a really interesting issue for DAs. These high-minded ideals at the beginning are perhaps going to give way to the reality of archiving these long-standing projects and maintaining these.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
Also makes me wonder about things like GitHub or whatever, you know. In some sense, they're completely ephemeral, and if you're getting it for free, you're not guaranteed anything. Like, it could just go belly up tomorrow and it's gone,
Mm-hmm.
and you have no recourse. I mean, and that's the case with all the free tools. You know. And we've seen that happen.
Mm-hmm.
Right on.
Does the digital library have like a backup plan? Because don't you keep all your collections offsite? Like you create all these spreadsheets, you put them into Archon,
Mm-hmm.
but then you also have it offsite storage.
Yeah, so both the digital library and in Archon are hosted actually mainly, there are servers in Gainesville, Tallahassee, and Atlanta for all of that material, and it gets backed up once a week. Good digital preservation policy says that there should be at least one server in a different geographic location than the South, because technically all three of those cities could be hit by a massive hurricane. It's knock on wood, probably not probable at this exact moment, but Florida in and of itself is kind of problematic. It could sink at any moment, technically. So we have that backup in place. Ideally, we would also have a second backup and a set of, tapes or whatever for that material in Canada or over in Russia or something like that, to cover our bases in terms of geographic disparity. But technically, yes, it's getting backed up, and it's in different locations on a weekly basis for both the digital library and for Archon. What becomes slightly problematic with digital preservation gets back to obsolete formats. If it's weird file formats, we might be able to get it off a disk, but how on earth are we ever going to open it?
Yeah, like if someone sends in a collection of stuff set on floppy disks.
Yep. We have a very fun collection over at the Pepper. It's a science education curriculum collection. They were creating video games for use in I guess elementary and middle school science classrooms. They started in the early 80s and did it up through the early 2000s. And they were graphic artists and programmers. So the second there was a new technology, even if it was only a new technology for like 5 minutes and then no one liked it anymore, they used it. So we have every format under the sun that's in that collection and no way to open half of it. So there's that issue with putting stuff onto actual hardware versus keeping it in a cloud too. So there's always fun problems in terms of keeping digital moving forward through all the iterations as we keep moving faster and faster into new formats and different hardware and all that.
Have you ever had such a breakdown and like something just isn't working with a project and you just start all over from the beginning?
Oh, luckily we haven't had to do that yet. the project where I had made a really bad decision and they were trying really hard to make that decision work, I believe they did end up pretty much trashing a pretty big set of images that they'd already taken of material and sort of starting over once they realized they didn't actually have to do what they had been attempting to do. But that's the only time that we've ever really had to like sort of completely reset, and we lost a lot of work. But yeah, luckily we haven't had one just go so far off the maps that we had to go back to the start. Any other comments or questions?
One really fast practical question. So for scholars or grad students in humanities, like how much do they need to know project management at a certain level, and how do they get that training? So, and this is a very practical question that I've been thinking about. So if I'm asking, I'm curious what you think. You know, what would you think that someone coming in to talk to you would need to know? I mean, or get trained on?
So, I consider it one of the biggest holes in my formal education. I was never taught project management, and it is what I spend a lot of my time doing. And I've learned it sort of through trial and error, through reading books, through asking people that have figured it out before me and other institutions. In terms of, and it's worked kind of well, but if you're a graduate student coming in, I would suggest, I know here they have the project management certificate program, which is a lot of hours, a lot of work. The great thing about project management is a lot of it's common sense. It's being organized, it's being on top of things, it's making sure everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing and staying on top of them to do it. So I learned it pretty well out of books and sort of asking colleagues, what would you do in this situation, or how would you suggest moving forward? But I think it is an area that a lot of different disciplines might benefit from having, like a simple like project management 101 kind of course that everyone has to take, because I think that is what work is more and more in all of the disciplines, is simply a project that you have to manage through.
I'd also add that for digital humanities specifically, a great training opportunity would be to integrate with Krystal's office, right? Like students in history, you're in history, correct?
International affairs.
International affairs, history, yeah. Students in other areas could, if we get better about announcing the type of projects that we're working on and areas for collaboration, or, hey, we need some, we actually, you have a lot of students that work with you, right? That is a really great way to get trained in project management, is to come into like a building like the library where we're doing and producing projects, often in collaboration with faculty members and big research questions, but you learn by doing. I think that's an overlooked opportunity at a lot of places. Is, yeah, you could go do a certificate, or you could read the literature, or you go to a place where they're doing projects and get involved.
One other thing, there's a resource that the university has that doesn't get referenced a lot, but has lots of tutorials, is lynda.com.
Right. Yeah,
And they have probably a dozen, either general project management courses and then specific software.
What is it called again?
Lynda.com.
It's Lynda with a Y.
And I mean, I'm just looking at it right now, and there's just lots and lots and lots.
There's tons. I did their project management series just to see what it was. It was a very good, like, sort of basic tutorial. A lot of the open source crowd, the giant MOOC classes, those have all been good. I did the one through the University of Virginia Business School, I think, does that one, and that one was pretty decent. But I think that's where I finally realized project management was just kind of common sense, because she'd be talking about something like, well, of course you would do it that way, like any other way wouldn't be a waste of everyone's time. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunities, I think, online, just to get a basic kind of idea of how to get started with a project and what managing a project through really means.
I think it's interesting that, like, no matter how digitized the project is, or whether you don't even see the people you're working with, when it comes to MPhil, you're working with other people. You need to have basic people skills and know how to talk to people and how to get your ideas across. And like, you can know all the software and know all the tools that you're using, but if you come off, by my friends, but if you come off like a dick, people don't want to work with you, and your project's not going to be as efficient and get done as quickly and as well. And it's just kind of, like you say, a common sense when you look at it.
Yeah, and it can be different if, I'm a big fan of face-to-face meetings, they've become a big thing, and I think because in a prior job, I would manage 20 interns that I never saw. Like I was trying to manage them through Skype, through email, Slack didn't exist yet, and you know, I went through every possible way I could figure out how to get them to talk to me, and there were still ones that we hired and I wouldn't hear from them until they'd finished their project, and they're like, hey, I'm done, here it is. So there's also the tricks of managing people that are in front of you versus the ones you never see too, which can be kind of fun with projects.